So I want you to just think for a second, right? I want you to think about a conversation that's going on. Now, you're sitting there in this conversation and someone's approached you and they've said, hey, like, can we catch up? Like, I really would love to chat with you. You're like, yeah, sweet, let's do that. It's at lunchtime, it's at a coffee shop, it's on the footy field, wherever it is. They say, hey, let's catch up. And then you sit there and they just begin to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And you're sitting there and you're kind of like, and they just keep going and going and going. You know those conversations that it's like someone just keeps going and you're like, surely they're going to run out of breath and I'm going to get a chance to speak in a moment. Like, do you know those conversations, those kind of people that come and they just talk and talk and talk, and then it's like, okay, all my problems are done, hooroo, see you later, we'll catch you next time I need to deal with my problems. And then they come back and it's the same thing. And this conversation wouldn't be worth a cold meat pie. Like, if we're being straight, it's kind of like it's a nothing conversation. It's dull and it's not really life-giving. Has anyone ever experienced those kind of conversations before? Then there's the other kind of conversations. These are the life-giving conversations. The ones where those friends that you have where you just sit there and you just talk, and it's not anyone's taking turns. It's not like you're looking at your watch going, well, he's spoken for 37 seconds, so now I get 37 seconds. The conversation just flows. It's not a competition, but there's just chemistry there in that friendship. That time where it's like time just loses time and you just keep talking and talking. You're like, wow, I've got to get to school or I've got to get to class or, whatever it is. And it's just that conversation that you just cherish. And it's the kind of person that when you walk away from that conversation, it's life-giving. You feel alive. There's something in you that says, yes, that was awesome. And if you were to evaluate your relationship with God right now, what kind of a relationship would you say it's like? Out of those two relationships, which one would you say it's like? You see, more often than not, I hear people saying that they feel like there's nothing going on between them and God. It's like, hey, God, I'm actually praying. I'm doing my bit, but whereabouts are you? I'm doing my bit. I poured out my heart to you tonight. Like, man, I'm getting nothing here. Come on, God. Have you ever had that feeling before where you feel like you're the one who's trying, you're the one who's putting in effort, and it's kind of like God's giving you crickets? Have you ever had that feeling before? If you're a Christian, chances are pretty high that you might have felt that. That moment where it's kind of like you felt like you've opened yourself up to God and you've kind of felt like maybe God hasn't returned that conversation or something hasn't quite happened. It's like, hey, God, I'm bringing you all of my problems, yet you're not fixing any of them. I'm bringing you everything and you're not fixing anything in my life. God, each week I come along to youth, I dedicate 3 hours on a Friday night. After courtyard time, it's 2 hours and 20 minutes. I even raise my hands in worship and I close my eyes in the slow songs, and yet you still don't speak to me. Tonight I want to talk about how we have conversations with God. About prayer, about how our prayer life, like just the different stages, the different levels and the different styles in which we can pray. And just my hope and my prayer is that tonight, honestly, I'm not going to give you any answers. But I hope tonight that as we chat, we begin to open up our hearts a little bit and we can do a bit of soul search and actually find out truly whereabouts we are in our relationship with God and if there's things that we can do to help that relationship thrive. Now, I think tonight we'll just go through this, but I would say that there's sort of 3 categories of prayer or 3 styles of praying that I want to talk about tonight. One of them's like the catalogue prayer, one of them's the correction prayer, and one of them's the common prayer. And tonight we're going to look at how through those different styles of praying we can get the most out of our relationship with God. So, what is a catalogue prayer? It's a fantastic question. It's a good one to ask. It's like when we flick through our Bible, this guy right here, and we look at it and we just sort of go, I wouldn't mind. Oh, yeah, there's cheese and biscuits there. I'll get some of those. And, yeah, God, I'm going to pray for, Mr. or Mrs. Right or, Prince or Princess Charming to come along today. And, God, I wouldn't mind a new Ferrari because they're really good. And, we actually come to God with these kind of prayers. Dear God, I want the Ferrari. God, I pray that today is the day that I meet the one. I pray that you keep me safe. God, I pray that you make my life better. God, today I pray that you give me what I want. We treat our relationship with God a bit like a catalogue. We just kind of look through it and we decide what we want. We say, I'll have some of that and I'll have some of that. Now, I want to start by saying there's actually nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're sitting here right now in your seat and you're like, oh man, I'm in trouble already, you're not. There's nothing wrong with that. Because here's the thing, God wants to hear our hearts. C.S. Lewis says, lay before God what is in us, not what should be in us. Lay before God what is in us. Can we get the slides? Is that all right? Oh, that's a different slide. That's okay. We've jumped the gun. That's good. Lay before God what is in us, not what should be in us. You know, for a lot of us, that's actually our reality right there. That's how we've known prayer our whole life. Our whole life has been this idea of I'm going to bring things to God. I'm going to bring God my list. There's a checklist of things that I want prayer for, and I'm going to bring those things to God. And that's all we've ever known prayer to be. That as much as we're trying, with these prayers of, I want this or I need that, or God, we come with our catalogue, with our list of things. We just kind of feel like there's no relationship there at all. It kind of feels like we're more going up to a genie asking for wishes than seeking a relationship with God. So I want to ask you, what are the catalogue prayers? The prayers that you've been praying. And I don't say this is not an attacking thing. This is actually for us to check the state of our heart. But what are the catalogue prayers that you like to pray? What are the things that you come to God and you say, hey, this is what I want. This is what's going on. What are those things in your heart, in your life? If you want to, you might even want to write those down on your phone, because we're going to talk about that in small group a little bit. But here's the thing, and I say this, that's not a bad thing, because Jesus actually invites us to do this. So this isn't a bad thing. Jesus lays it out for us. He says in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. As much as you want to talk to God, God is willing to listen. As much as you talk to God, God is willing to listen. God wants to listen. God actually delights in hearing the prayers of your heart. When we prayed before, there was something in God that said, yes, my children are talking to me. God delights in that. God delights in that. I think of that and I think God not only has the patience nor the tolerance, but God actually delights in me coming before him and saying, hey, this is my prayer list. This is what I want. These are the things that I need in my life. I remember when I was in primary school, I had this dog and her name was Gypsy. She was a fat Labrador. Has anyone ever seen a skinny Labrador before? No, it's not a thing. So they're all fat labs. So she's probably just a normal shaped lab. But this Labrador Gypsy had this tendency to wander, like, loyal Labradors do. And Gypsy would run away and she would always come back. It was on the third day sometimes. But, she would always come back, right? So Gypsy would always come back. And then there was this one time where she didn't come back. Gypsy just didn't come back. And so I went to a school where, we were encouraged to pray every morning. So, me being the good Christian boy I was every day, who's got a prayer request? Me, Gypsy, yeah, we'll put it up on the board, we'll pray again. And, for the first week it was fine. For the second week it was okay. For the third week it was getting a bit laborious. And then for the fourth week, my teacher actually rung up Mum and said, you've got to tell your son that the dog's not coming home and to stop praying that prayer. Now, Mum never told me that until I was an adult. That would have made me really sad. But, I continued to pray. And then after 5 weeks, this is true, after 5 weeks, get this, a skinny Labrador walked through our gate. She was very malnourished, but we got her back to good health. But this Labrador Gypsy came back from out of nowhere and she came home after 5 weeks of praying. My prayer to bring Gypsy back, if we were to look back on that, do you know what? That was never, ever going to solve world peace. Like, it wasn't. That wasn't the kind of prayer that was going to shape or change a nation. But in that moment, God delighted to hear the prayers of my heart. God delighted to hear the prayers of my heart. Oh, wow, my child is talking to me. So when I talk about these catalogue prayers, I think sometimes we can always feel like, it's a little bit embarrassing. It's actually not. God delights in hearing that. But even more than that, God actually delights in a conversation. Because I think sometimes, if we're being honest, when we have the catalogue prayers, when we have the list of prayers, we end up going to God, we end up blabbering like that person who just talks. Okay, cool, I'll see you again later on. And we never actually give God the chance to begin to speak to us. I believe for some of us who call ourselves Christians in this room, that tonight we actually need to open up the communication lines between us and God. Jen Johnson says, God is always inviting us into a deeper connection. So how do we take our prayer life? How do we actually take our prayer life from one that's been like a catalogue prayer life where we just kind of look through the highlights and we say what we do or we don't want? And how do we create a deeper connection between us and God? And I believe it starts with the correction of our soul. Now this example might not fly because I'm definitely not into sailing, but I picture this is how it happens with sailing, so go with me here. But when a sailing boat wants to go somewhere, like their sails are going one way and they're getting caught by the wind, but then the wind changes direction. Now that sailboat has a choice. Either it continues going to its path and it has to make a few adjustments, a few corrections as it goes along, or if it doesn't change anything, then it might actually lose where it's going. The point in which the sailboat originally wanted to go, if it doesn't actually correct anything, then the sailboat will move away, it will drift away. And I think that's the case for some of us in our walk with Jesus. I think for some of us, we actually need to ask ourselves the question, hey, where do I want to go in my faith? What do I want my relationship to God look like? With God to look like? Got that really good. What do I want it to look like? What do I want that relationship to be? And then for you to actually take stock and go, hey, well, where's it headed right now? Is there some correction, some things in my life that I actually need to do to help me get to where I want to go? Because right now my life isn't headed the way that I want it to go. For me, this has been real for me the last few months. Humble little brag here, but I am excellent at the shopping cart, at the catalogue prayer list. I go to God and I'm like, right, I got my killer checklist. We're on here. God, I want to pray for salvation. I want to pray for this. I want to pray for that. I get it going. But you know what my problem is I'm too much like the blabbermouth. I sit there and I talk at God a lot. I talk to God a lot. I say, hey, God, how cool would this be? How amazing would this be? Hey, God, I need you to help me with this. Hey, God. But do you know what? Then I go, oh, cool. All right, I got to go to work. And then a little while ago, one of the pastors here at church sent out a text message. He said, hey, I'm meeting at 8 o'clock at church every morning for prayer. There's no set thing. We're not going to pray together as a group just to sit with you in the presence of God. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. But what I do in the mornings is I sit and I read. But God actually began to convict to me and reveal to me that actually what I was doing was I was robbing my relationship with God because I wouldn't actually sit and pause and listen to what God was saying. I continued reading because I wanted to get on to the next chapter because it was exciting to finish a chapter or, whatever it was. I get so excited, get so bunkered down that it was kind of like I was missing the point. For some of you guys, that's the same. For some of you, that's the pattern of your prayer life at the moment. You actually need to go, cool, how do I readjust this? How do I sit with God? How do I invite God into my heart? How do I do this on a regular basis? For me, it just looked like, actually, it sounds ironic, but stopping and reading for the morning and actually just sitting here, just sitting in God's presence, just listening to God's voice. It's uncomfortable sometimes. It's a little bit hard. I get a little bit distracted. I like counting the fans and, the lights in the building. But, just as I sit and I still my heart, I just begin to enjoy God's presence. God's Mother Teresa says this quote, God speaks in the silence of the heart. Listening is the beginning of prayer. God speaks in the silence of the heart. Listening is the beginning of prayer. So the minute that we quit yapping, the minute that we quit talking at God, the minute that we quit going, hey, we actually sit and we listen, that's when God can begin to speak to us. That's when this conversation becomes alive. That's when this conversation goes from us talking at God all the time. And do you know what? Like I say, if that's all you ever want to praise, that's all you ever want to do, that's the kind of relationship with God that you want, then God delights in hearing those prayers. But for those of you who are saying, hey, I want my faith to go deeper. I want my prayer life to be on fire. I don't want to have to go from Friday night to Friday night hoping that I survive the week. Maybe it's actually going to take you to correct your soul a little bit to say, hey, whereabouts is my soul headed? Maybe it's actually going to take you just to sit in silence and sit in the presence of God and just begin to listen to what God says. As I read before in Matthew 11, it says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And do you know what? Some of us pull up stumps there. When we read that, we pull up stumps. Can we get that slide up? 3, 2, 1. Oh, I thought that was going to be perfect. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And that's where we stop. But then Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Now, when we talk about yoke, it's really important to know that we're not talking about the yellow things in the middle of eggs. Like, as a kid and a teenager and sometimes an adult, I'm like, "Oh, eggs." Like, it makes me really happy. That's not what we're talking about here. The best example I can give of that, it's kind of like it's a bar in between the animals. So when we talk about a yoke, it's the bar in between the animals. As the animals begin to walk and work, the bar is the thing that helps guide the animals in where they want to go. So take my yoke. So Jesus is saying, surrender control over to me. Let me be the one who guides you on your path. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. For those of you who felt like God hasn't listened to you, for those of you who have felt like, "Hey God, come on, I'm praying for 5 minutes flat out. I'm giving it my best. I even gave you 7 things I want prayer for this week." Maybe it's time for you to correct the path of your prayers. Maybe it's time for you to begin to sit in the silence and begin to listen to what God is saying. Now, do you know what? When we begin to listen to what God's saying, it doesn't mean that we get everything that we want from God. It doesn't mean that, God automatically answers our prayers. The longest going prayer that I can remember in my life has been, the prayer for my sister. She doesn't yet know Jesus. And my prayer for her is that she would encounter the grace and the goodness of God. Now, I've been praying that prayer for nearly 20 years now. Whoa, you're old, Jason. Thanks for that. That's been my prayer for a long time. Now, God hasn't answered that prayer in the way that I want God to. But you know what I find interesting? When I pray that prayer and then I actually sit and I wait and I begin to hear from God, do you know what God does in that moment? God actually gives me compassion for people who don't grow up in a Christian home. God begins to give me compassion. God begins to say to me, "Well, what kind of language are you using when you preach? Is that warm and is that friendly for people who don't know Jesus? Would you say that if your sister was in the room?" God begins to speak to me, and it's amazing how that gives me just this compassion for people. So when someone comes to me and says, "Hey, you know what? God hasn't answered my prayers in the way that I want to," say, "Hey, you know what? Me too." Doesn't make my faith any worse. Doesn't make it any not as good or whatever. I'm praying the wrong prayer. But what I find is it actually does more in my heart than I realize. When I pray those prayers and I actually sit and I listen to God, God opens up my eyes. He helps me to see my friends who don't yet know Jesus. He helps me begin to pray for you. God begins to do a number in my heart as I actually begin to listen, as I bring my prayers to God. Now I say, God hasn't answered that prayer in the way that I want yet. I'm going to keep praying. You better believe I'm going to keep praying for my sister. But as I pray, it's not so much about me checking off the list of things to do. It's about me sitting there and beginning to open up that conversation with God a little bit more. Not me talking at God as much, but me actually sitting and going, I just want to hear from God. And it is amazing the things that God is revealing to me. Bit by bit, little bit by little bit, I'm beginning to understand a little bit more about God's character. I'm learning things. I'm hearing from God. Mother Teresa says this, another amazing quote. She says, "I do not pray for success. I pray for faithfulness." Ooh. I don't pray for success. I pray for faithfulness. I don't bring my personal shopping list to God. I pray that God will continuously help me in my correction for the path that I'm wanting to go. For some of us, we've been praying for success. Some of us have been thinking this is the only way that I can pray. God is kind of like a genie. But God wants so much more. God wants so much more than just to grant you wishes. How boring would that be? Imagine if everyone was driving around in Ferraris. Wouldn't be fun anymore. I mean, it probably would be a little bit fun, but imagine if God just said yes to everything. Where would the relationship be? But God delights in knowing who you are. What would your relationship be like with God? What would your relationship with God be like if you prayed for faithfulness over success? If every time you prayed, you said, hey, God, I'm not too worried about the success, but God, teach me to be more faithful. God, as I stray from the path, as I lose my reference, God, I pray that you just begin to correct my soul. Speak to me in the areas of my life that need correction. Help me stay on point. Help me stay faithful with you. Instead of bringing the catalogue to God and saying, hey, God, here's my list. Hooroo, I'm out for a week. I'll see you then. We actually begin to sit and say, hey, God, I pray that I'm faithful this week. I pray that I'm faithful this week. What could your relationship with God be like if you went to Jesus, all of you who are wearied and burdened, and you took guidance from God and you began to learn from God? What would your relationship with God look like? What would our world look like? What would this youth ministry look like if we actually began to sit and take guidance from God and learn from God? This all sounds really good. Sounds really, like, oh, cool, this is deep, like we're going there. But how do we actually live this out? How do we actually live out, this intimacy with prayer, this faithfulness in our relationship with God? How do we actually live that out? We have 3 hours on a Friday night and sometimes 1 hour on a Sunday morning. Hashtag shameless plug, Newlife Youth Sunday. Woo! That's it. Someone clapped. Come on. That's good. That's exciting. How do I keep the candle burning from Friday to Friday? That's the questions that we begin to ask. That's a long time between being at church. That's a long time between talking to God. And the answer is we don't live Friday to Friday. We don't treat these 3 hours as the only sacred 3 hours in our week. If we're doing that, we've missed the point. You don't separate your prayers and your normal life. Prayer becomes your life. You don't separate your prayers from normal life. Prayer becomes life. Anthony Bloom says this: a prayer makes sense only if it is lived. Unless they are lived, unless life and prayer becomes completely interwoven, prayers become sort of a polite strain which you offer to God at moments when you are giving him the time. Oh, bit intense, that one. Is your relationship with God something that's serious to you? Is your relationship with God something that you're like, hey, you know what? This isn't just a strain. This isn't the pleasantries on a Friday night. This isn't a nice song to sing on a Friday night, but this is something that I want to commit my life to. I want my prayer life and my life to be one thing. I want my life to be one consistent, continual prayer. This looks like you walking into classroom, praying, saying, hey, God, speak to me in this classroom. What do you think our classrooms would look like if every single one of you, every class that you walked into, you began to pray? You're going to say, hey, God, what do you want me to see? Who do you want me to be praying for? What are the things that you want me to see in this room? As you actually sat in prayer with God in the classroom, what would the classrooms look like? What would school look like? If before you got on the sporting field and set a G in yourself up, ready for a B, if you actually said, hey, God, I pray right now you settle my heart. God, teach me how to love these people on the field. What would that look like? What would it look like if you were in the line in the canteen, the boring line on your way to the canteen at lunchtime or whatever you call it, the cafe, and you actually just said, hey, God, I just want to be in your presence right now. I want to begin to hear from you.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us. We really hope that you love this message. If you have any prayer requests, all our details are in the description below. So please feel free to like and comment anything that you were particularly encouraged by. Also, share this video with anyone that you think needs to hear this message, and make sure you click on the bell.